Welcome to all as you join. Welcome to this, I guess, the first, can't remember, of the jointly listed seminars between the Kennedy School Solar Geoengineering Policy Seminar Series and the long-running Energy Policy Seminars. Thanks very much to Amanda, Henry Lee, and co for allowing us to do these co-lists. I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute, but before I get going, I'll do this again at the end. The next three in the Solar Geo Seminar Series, to which you're all invited, are on March 25th, Global Security and Solar Geoengineering with Elizabeth Chalecki and Stuart Patrick. April 4th, co-listed with this again, Space-Based Solar Geoengineering and Astropolitics with Oliver Morton and Pete Worden. And April 22nd, Indigenous Peoples and Solar Geoengineering with AJ Larson and John Moore. Thank you very much for coming to this seminar. So the way this is going to work is the two initial speakers, Kelly Wanser and Steve Hamburg, will each speak for 15 minutes max, probably a little bit less. And then Joe Aldy will offer initial commentary for about 10 minutes and then open to questions. So I'll now proceed to introductions. So first to speak is Kelly Wanser. Kelly is Executive Director of SilverLining, a nonprofit focused on ensuring the safety in the context of near-term climate risk. They've been the main and most active nonprofit working on what we call solar geoengineering, what she would call solar climate intervention, I guess she'll tell us, and been very active in developing funds for research in that area. Kelly also co-founded and serves as a senior advisor to the University of Washington Marine Cloud Brightening Project. And prior to that, as a technologist and entrepreneur, Ms. Wanser founded companies in IT infrastructure, analytics, and security fields, and has authored about 20 patents. And I'll introduce Steve Hamburg. Steve Hamburg is Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President of the Environmental Defense Fund, as well as Executive Manager of MethaneSat of Harvard fame, because Steve Woofsey, one of the leads of that, is in the science side of Harvard. Steve has published more than 100 scientific papers on biogeochemistry, climate change impacts, carbon, GHG accounting, et cetera. And served as a lead author for IPCC, a whole bunch of committee work. Maybe most notably, he's serves as a member of the Division of Earth and Life Sciences on the National Academies of Science and Medicine's Engineering Advisory Board, and many other advisory capacities. And he's worked on this topic, serving as a co-chair of the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative for a decade. So thank you very much to Kelly and Steve for joining, and over to you, Kelly.
Thank you very much, David, and august panel. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm an admirer of all of your work, and really pleased to talk to the Energy Seminar Program at Harvard. I am going to share my screen now, hopefully.
I think I just enabled it. I hope I did.
Okay, let's see if that works. And forgive me if I've got some background noise. I'm in a hotel. So I'm going to sort of cover quite a few ideas along the lines that we've been working with US policymakers on. I encourage you, if you have questions or you're interested in more information, to contact me directly. My email address is here. Welcome questions and comments. I'm assuming many of you who are attending this seminar have looked into the topic, but I'll give a little bit of a high level that, in particular, SilverLining is focused on near-term climate risk. And that means we're looking at the first order problem of trapped heat energy in the climate system and what that does to natural systems and what kinds of risks it brings to bear in the near term. We look at the near term in the next 30 to 40 years, and we look at solar geoengineering or solar climate intervention in the context of the time horizon in which our portfolio is lacking responses that can significantly reduce that heat energy in the climate system that's causing these escalating risks. And those risks include the extreme catastrophic events that are projected to grow. They include the impacts on vulnerable populations, which the most recent IPCC report places at about 3.3 billion people through the middle of the century. And we're concerned about the problem of what options are available for them, threats to the world species, and the rising risk of major natural systems reaching tipping points in which they rapidly and maybe permanently change state and even accelerate the climate problem. So for us, solar geoengineering, solar climate intervention is really about a portfolio mix. And in particular, looking at the next 10 to 30 years where we lack responses apart from the kinds of things that Steve and EDF work on with respect to short-term forcers in how we really can bring heat energy out of the Earth system quickly. And this is the way we talk about the problem with policymakers. And recently in the United States, in 2021, there were 2 major reports that are relevant to this problem from the National Academy of Sciences, one looking at the direction of the Global Change Research Program in the United States and emphasizing an orientation toward risk management and management of impacts on vulnerable populations, which was also reiterated in the recent IPCC study. And then the report called Reflecting Sunlight, which recommended a major research effort in the United States on proposals to reduce heat energy in the Earth system by increasing the reflection of sunlight from the planet. So when we talk to policymakers and other people, we start out with this visualization of the sunlight reflecting off aerosols and clouds in the atmosphere. This is a NASA simulation. And as David's talked about many times, the idea behind solar geoengineering, solar climate intervention is to slightly increase the reflection of sunlight from particles and clouds in the atmosphere. And so that's the sort of fundamental question, is whether those techniques for doing that, which scientists have identified as perhaps the most promising rapid approaches, are viable options for the portfolio and how we might make decisions about them. I'm going to start out by saying that we've had some success in the policy sphere over the past 3 or 4 years across bipartisan lines, talking about these topics. And one of the things that we think has contributed to this success is the language that we use and the way we talk about the problem. And so in the policy sector, we've focused on using language that's more accessible and less technocentric. And we followed the 2015 National Academy of Sciences report in emphasizing the term climate intervention, which also helpfully brings in a sort of metaphor of medicine, which is a similar kind of complex systems problem. We also talk about reflecting sunlight. And so that's helped, I think, ground the conversation quite a bit better in some of these arenas. Similarly, when we talk about the problem space that we're aimed at, we're really focused on fundamental questions of safety, risk, and the generation of information, mostly through physical sciences and physical sciences research, which I'll talk about. And so you will see from me that I encourage members of the community to move away from the geoengineering term, partly because what I'm going to talk about is that the big challenge that we face is a scientific question. And it's the scientific question of aerosol forcing on the atmosphere as the problem that we're aimed at. But in that context, like I said, we've had some success across the aisle, partly because of the way that we talk about it, and partly because the dynamics of the problem are a little bit different than intuition might have told people. And I think Joe Aldy's work on this topic is really interesting, in the sense that in talking across the aisle about topics like solar climate intervention, we've seen a receptivity to an alignment on the severity of the problem with the nature of the solution space that you're open to. And so we've had Republicans tell us that when we're talking to them about these kinds of topics, it enhances our credibility in terms of the level of seriousness that we're talking about with respect to the climate problem, and the orientation that we're taking in terms of the solution space. And so the whole political dynamic has not been necessarily as we anticipated it in terms of what resonates in what parts of the political sphere. But it has been the case that this has been a place for bipartisan cooperation. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I think, and I'm going to talk about a couple of policy principles behind it. But one is that there's a principle in both US and international law on environmental safety. And in the context of environmental safety, in the US thrust, in both domestically and internationally, there's a strong emphasis on the science basis, which means that policy related to environmental safety includes a monitoring component, so a database component, and often includes a scientific assessment, which means that you're able to sort of capture the extant data and information from the scientific community and pull it together and conduct periodic assessments on the state of the natural system. And so I'm going to talk mostly about that, and then I'm going to talk about a couple of concepts that might be newer with respect to climate, and maybe they shouldn't be newer, but disaster risk management and what it means to do risk management and how that links to vulnerable populations and environmental justice. So first, I'm going to just touch on the principle of safety in environmental law and policy. I learned most of what I know from Sue Biniaz and Dan Bodansky, so I encourage you to read their papers on the C2ES website on these topics, which start from the perspective of international environmental law as pertains to this area, and then how that might translate through to a US approach. But this principle of safety is a fundamental context, and it's a useful context for a sort of equitable approach to decision making. It's one of the better examples of this principle in play is the Montreal Protocol that governs the ozone layer. And interestingly, for the stratospheric form of solar geoengineering, solar climate intervention also governs this area. And we're going to see for the first time a fairly substantial coverage of stratospheric solar climate intervention in the next ozone assessment, which comes out in the fall in 2022. And so you'll see how this starts to play out in terms of the gathering of scientific information, scientific assessment, and how that might feed into the decision process. And with respect to that, I'm going to say we're going to focus on what we've seen in working with US agencies, international scientists, and policymakers as a fundamental question or fundamental problem in solar climate intervention, which is aerosol forcing on the atmosphere. So when we look at research, which is kind of the entry point for policy, we have this problem that clouds and particles influence the atmosphere, which you can see here from a picture of ship tracks in space. That influence from particles, particularly particles generated by human activity, so the particulates and pollution, they're affecting the atmosphere in different ways in different layers. And it's one of the largest uncertainties in climate. And what you can see in this chart, which is an IPCC chart, is we have the anthropogenic effects on climate. The dark blue effects are the warming effects, and the light blue effects are effectively cooling effects or counter warming effects, the biggest of which are the influence on particles, either directly bouncing sunlight or increasing the reflectivity of clouds. And so one of the first things we talk about with policymakers is the fact that the physical action underlying solar climate intervention is not new. In fact, it's already occurring. It's just occurring inadvertently, and we don't understand it very well. It looks like, because of the level at which it's occurring, it's a really important thing to understand in terms of our plans to reduce those particulates. So what we have going on today is that we have a highly uncertain cooling effect from the reflectivity generated by particles in the lower atmosphere from pollution. And that effect is projected to go down as we're successful in reducing emissions and reducing pollutants for public health. And so, so we have an uncertainty as to what that will mean for heat energy in the Earth system as we bring down that cooling effect that we're generating by accident. We also have an accidental effects going on at the high cloud layer as aircraft traverse through the clouds. And scientists think that the plumes from aircrafts are slightly thickening those clouds at the high layer, and that's causing potentially an insulating warming effect because of the way those clouds work. Air traffic is projected to increase by 7-fold or more over the next few decades, and so that effect could go from being relatively insignificant to significant. And in the stratosphere, where we normally think there isn't a lot of extant pollution, and there isn't today, Rockets are traveling through, and a fair amount of the rocket traffic generates the type of pollution particles that could cause this effect in the stratosphere if it were happening at scale. And rocket traffic is projected to increase very substantially over the next few decades. And so it's possible that that traffic could generate the kind of cooling effect that's postulated by solar climate intervention or solar climate engineering. And so what we talk to policymakers about is that we have this open question on this aerosol forcing on climate. And it applies to anthropogenic sources in a way that's really important for what happens to the climate system over the next few decades. And it's a highly overlapping and mostly similar problem as the problem of intentional solar climate intervention, where you're trying to optimize that effect. So what we talk to policymakers about are the kinds of things you might need to do to explore that question. And so that has resulted over the past few years in our legislative work in a program at NOAA called the Earth's Radiation Budget Program. And you can see here the description of what that program is. And it's really looking at the sort of equivalent problem of anthropogenic aerosol forcing and solar climate intervention type aerosol forcing in something that you would look to understand, to be able to detect and monitor, and to be able to evaluate and assess. And so here's the language, the legislative language that informs that. And then how it manifests itself is capabilities for improving the monitoring and baselining of the stratosphere, for example. In this case, there's also a low cloud version. And it links to other NOAA programs where you're trying to increase the observational capabilities of the planet and our ability to evaluate and assess them. In the context of NOAA, and again, I'm focused on the stratosphere, and there are marine cloud and low cloud analogs for this, but the kinds of studies you would do are similar for intentional interventions at the sort of process level, are similar to studies that happen already in how they evaluate the influence of new jet fuels as they're released. And this is an example of that type of experiment where a plume release is made intentionally for the purposes of studying how it flows out into the atmosphere. And so we work with NOAA on that kind of program, similar with DOE, looking at the influence of particles on clouds and growing our national capabilities to do that, with the idea of working towards, inside the US, a sort of interagency approach to being able to undertake an assessment of these things and to identify the capabilities and science that you would need in order to do that. And then I'll just I'll touch on the note of-
we're sort of at time. You can come back to it in questions.
Yeah, okay. I'll just say we'll feed this information into a risk management approach, or at least that's the goal. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much. All right, Steve, over to you.
Great, thanks so much. And it's great to be with everyone. I was musing, I live in Providence, and it's not very far down the road, and I still miss the in-person interactions, I have to say. I guess in that sense, I'm old-fashioned.
We will get back there, I promise.
I hope so. That's
whatever my promise is worth just as much.
And I see some folks that I recognize in the list, so it's great to see virtually, know you're there. So EDF got involved in these issues of whether we call it geoengineering or whatever we're going to call it. I gave up on the semantics long ago, so there's so many names. And as Kelly referenced, the 2015 report from the National Academies, we spent so much time in that consensus committee discussing the title that I've given up on this. But I got involved because going further back, I started looking at the effects of climate change on natural systems in a big way a long time ago in my own work. My first paper was 35 years ago on this issue. And fast forward a little bit, I left academia and joined EDF. And 12 years ago, we held a science day. It's a 5-hour in-depth discussion with our board and experts on the issue of what we then called geoengineering. and David was one of the speakers, and we really sort of started to look at it and the need for us to learn more. So we at EDF started getting involved, whether it was the SilverLining meeting, and a diversity of forums to try and understand how we as a large environmental organization deeply committed to addressing the climate crisis could help inform this. My reflections are just going to be the journey that we've been on for this past dozen years. And one is I want to mention that in all of the early work in particular, and I think it continues, the scientific community has always been adamant, as I think it should be, about avoiding hubris in terms of what we can do about the climate and the implications and those feedbacks to both social systems and natural systems. And I think that's a really important caveat as we think about these types of issues. So I think the key, as we started thinking about that at EDF, early on, we agreed to work with the Royal Society on, as David mentioned, the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative. And that really was organized towards thinking about how to engage civil society writ large on a global basis. We're talking about interventions that ultimately are global in nature. They're about one climate system. And we know that it's very easy to cause perverse outcomes in just any system. So we always have to be cautious there. So as we think about how do we generate the social consensus to take action at this scale, with deliberate action in this scale. And I think agree completely with Kelly, and we need to increase our knowledge. That's absolutely going to be a center to be able to take any action in a way that we're confident. And I might mention that we often think we understand systems, but we really don't. So I'm currently working on hydrogen. And one of the things we quickly discovered was that most people, like almost everybody, didn't understand that hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas and that we knew nothing about leakage. And if we're going to deploy hydrogen effectively as a decarbonization strategy, we really didn't understand the net radiative forcing implications of hydrogen. And that's something that has been around. I learned about hydrogen as a potential way to address decarbonization related to climate change in 1975 as a student. So this idea has been around a long time, yet we developed a whole massive effort within the US, billions of dollars, in the European Commission and India and China and across the globe, yet we were absent some really fundamental science. And I think that applies to the topic we're talking about today as well. We really need to make sure that we have a deep enough understanding so that we at least go in with our eyes open. The second key component is that we need to ensure this is a global conversation. One of the reasons that we started the Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative about 12 years ago was to try and make this a global conversation. It was not at that time, and it's still largely a Northern Hemisphere developed country conversation. By having workshops across the globe and then ultimately even funding modeling exercise in countries across the global South. We need to remember this is a global conversation, that we do not have the right as any one group of people to make a decision. And whether we could or not, I'll defer to the experts. Many at the Kennedy School know far more about building that global consensus, but we have to recognize that, and that the institutions to do that are not readily available and have not engaged in this issue. We had the privilege of working with the World Academy of Sciences on SRMGI, but really need to, and what I like to refer to as the ever expanding spiral. We need to make this conversation grow and grow and grow, whatever the outcome. And I have no predisposition to know where we're going to land. I have my biases, but they're irrelevant. The real process is how do we engage people effectively. And the third point I would make is that we have to be really careful not to politicize the science, that this has to be about open inquiry and really understanding it. There are a lot of people with strong opinions about the role of technology in solving the climate crisis. And we have to make sure that our conversation can be pursued to develop our knowledge, expand the involvement of more and more groups of people across the globe without it becoming a political element or politicizing it in a large degree. We are seeing slow growing engagement, but it has been slow. I think that we also need to make sure that we use the levers available to us. So I do a lot of work on short-lived climate pollutants, as Kelly mentioned, which gives us an enormous lever for reducing the rate of warming over the next couple of decades. It is so large a lever, and it is so actionable. And luckily we saw in the last COP a commitment to do that, that we can actually make big impacts. So these types of interventions at a global scale, we need to be really cautious in using them when we have large opportunities before us that are relatively easily implemented, and in many cases have minimal costs associated, or even net negative in some cases. So I'd end with the notion that we have to be enormously cautious. We have to expand this conversation. We have to ensure that we're focused on minimizing any kind of perverse outcomes by expanding our scientific knowledge. And if we do all of those things, we will have a chance of coming out at a prudent result. As an ecologist who's seen so many interventions gone wrong across different parts of the globe, I'm always cautious because hubris can be our downfall. And this is a question where we can't afford to bring it to the table. With that, I look forward to a conversation and some questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And with no further ado, over to Joe Aldy for up to 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate as well Kelly and Steve joining us today and sharing with us their insights about how we should be thinking about solar geoengineering or solar climate intervention. I don't want to get into the semantics either. I think what's important, though, is recognizing that the debate, for those of us who've been focused on climate change policy for decades, has clearly evolved over time when we think about the full set of potential ways in which we can mitigate the risk posed by climate change. When I first started working on this issue in the late 1990s, it was almost exclusively a conversation about emission mitigation. I think over time we saw the debate evolve some as people were getting more and more serious about the need to think about adaptation, recognizing that we weren't doing enough to mitigate our emissions and to avoid any adverse impacts associated with climate change. I think now we're starting to see the conversation evolve again as we think about the potential for broadening even further our risk management strategies to think about intervening in the climate to manage the radiation budget with respect to solar geoengineering, and to think about the prospect for large-scale carbon dioxide removal and how all those fit within the portfolio. So let me make three sets of comments as we think about what role I think solar geoengineering could play in US policy and in US politics. So first, and I think back, putting on my old hat when I worked in government, if we're putting forward the idea that we should pursue a new policy to address issue X, one of the first questions is, how are we going to actually be able to show that it's working? How do we actually show to the American people this was a good decision if we decide to go forward with this policy? And I think that's really important given a lot of the uncertainties, as we've already heard about from both Kelly and Steve, a lot of the uncertainties that characterize our current understanding of solar geoengineering. I think this is really hard. We're really right now at the beginning of the scientific understanding of climate change attribution. We've seen some over the past couple of years, more and more evidence about our ability to attribute what we see in terms of extreme weather events to a changing climate. And so the challenge is, how do we extract a signal about the impact of solar geoengineering in reducing those climate change impacts? So I think we need to further improve our understanding of climate change, and then further improve our understanding technically about how solar geoengineering might be reducing either the intensity or the frequency of some of these adverse impacts we associate with a changing climate. So I think that's why it's really important for us to think through some of the work, as Kelly described, about Earth's radiation budget at NOAA, about the need to improve our deep understanding of the science, as Steve noted in his comments as well. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's more than just obviously a technical issue. It gets to an issue about how we try to interpret, in the context of uncertainty, what that signal is for a public that, to be honest, doesn't seem to be able to tolerate much discussion in any kind of technical sense about uncertainties, that it may be difficult to convey through the media what these uncertainties means. And sometimes when we are in climate change debates, if we try to have a candid conversation about uncertainty, bad faith actors may exploit that to say, we don't know enough, let's delay action until we study more. And we need to find a way to, I think, to communicate and to tell a story, to Kelly's point, the importance of having a narrative about how we need to make decisions in the presence of uncertainty, because we have enough understanding that when we look at the totality, balance some of the uncertainties, think about the risk of action, think about the risk of inaction, that at the end of the day, we're going to want to take certain paths forward in our climate change risk mitigation strategies, even if we are not fully certain about their outcomes, excuse me. I think the second thing that's going to be a challenge with all this is the fact that we are dealing with the fact that people really don't fully grasp what adverse climate change impacts may look like, what catastrophic climate change may look like. And what we're going to be trying to make the case for is that in the presence of not really fully having experienced the counterfactual, it may be really, really horrible suffering that we're trying to avoid with any of our climate risk mitigation strategies. And I think that's why it's going to be important for us to develop this kind of narrative and storytelling for why it's important for moving forward on this. I think that also makes it challenging for politicians who I think do not properly balance, as my colleague Richard Zeckhauser points out, risk of omission versus risk of commission. Risk of not taking an action, they may not feel the blame for, but if they actually affirmatively go forward with a policy action, whatever its outcomes may be, they will enjoy either the acclaim or the blame for failure to actually deliver on what we said they were going to do. And I think that's going to be a question about how we can think about bringing not just deeper understanding of the science, but I think also of some of the social sciences, something David and I have talked about in the past, to really understand what determines sort of the behavior of decision-making among our policymakers and what kind of information do they use? What's the kind of political framing that influences how they think about that? I think that's all going to be important as we move forward to better understand the role of solar geoengineering in our climate policy, in our climate politics. Second, let me make a couple comments about the implications for solar geoengineering on the overall portfolio of actions. As Kelly alluded to, I've done some work trying to think through about whether solar geoengineering might, as some have claimed, contribute to moral hazard, might deter some of the incentives for emission mitigation, or whether or not it might galvanize more aggressive action on emission mitigation, maybe galvanize more efforts on adaptation, because it might serve as an awful action alert. That if the idea is that the government decision makers say, hey, we actually have to put some particles in the upper atmosphere and deflect some of the incoming sunlight, that might signal to people that this is actually a really serious problem. We're now doing some things that we probably wouldn't have wanted to consider or imagine decades ago, but given where we are today and given what we've already locked in the near-term future, this is something we need to do to try to reduce some serious human suffering around the world. I think it's going to be important for us in doing this, think about how we engage civil society, how we think about engaging the business community and academia to inform the policy process to think about whether solar geoengineering is going to serve as a complement or a substitute to other ways of reducing climate change risk. I think there's a way in which one could take a kind of all of the above strategy. Given where we are, I think, with the state of the global climate, we need an all of the above strategy. We need emission mitigation that is ambitious today. We need investment in adaptation today that's ambitious. And I think we need to get serious in understanding what role solar geoengineering could play to help us reduce climate change risk. Now, I think it's also important, as Kelly was noting, about how this may actually enable us to have a more serious, sophisticated conversation with some who have been traditionally skeptical about climate change policy. It may even enhance our credibility, as she noted, in some circles, because we're now saying we want to have everything on the table as a way to manage and reduce climate change risk. But I think we need to do so in a way that doesn't actually cause some who've been quite vocal in support of actions on climate change to think it's a threat to what we need to do on the serious decarbonization necessary to combat climate change. Let me close with a couple of comments real quick about the environmental justice implications that I think are relevant in light of both what Kelly and Steve brought up in their opening comments. As Steve noted, this needs to be a global conversation. This has been consistently a conversation just among a few governments in the Northern Hemisphere, academics in these countries. Obviously, when we think about the implications, when we think about the potential role governance is going to play, we need to think about how we engage partners around the world, and especially in the global South. I think there's an argument to be made that for many in developing countries who are likely to be most vulnerable to a changing climate, that solar geoengineering that helps reduce suffering over the next couple of decades might be the most important strategy we could take to manage and reduce their exposure to climate change risk in that near-term window. I think it's also important, though, that we recognize not just to say, hey, those who are most vulnerable are going to benefit the most from this, but to think through procedurally how we engage them in the process of the decision making, how we make sure that their leaders can rely on experts in their countries and in their regions so that they can be informed in how they engage and partner with decision makers in the Northern Hemisphere. I also think it's important for us to think about the potential environmental justice implications for those here within the United States as well. That solar geoengineering might not just be something that helps reduce those who are most vulnerable in the global south, but also those who may be lower income or in higher risk communities here within the United States. And there's a potential here for solar geoengineering to help reduce the risk that they may bear over the next couple of decades. But we also need to think here about the interplay as part of the overall overall climate change mitigation portfolio, that if we have solar geoengineering that is a complement to aggressive decarbonization, you can see how they are the individuals who are most vulnerable to a changing climate, who have also consistently been most vulnerable to the adverse ancillary impacts of fossil fuel combustion, such as through local air pollution, that if we're able to think about solar geoengineering and mitigation as complements, you can drive down the use of fossil fuels.
You're at your time.
I have like 2 more sentences, David. We're able to drive down their exposure to pollution, and we're able to drive down their risk being exposed to climate change. That might help us demonstrate how this broader portfolio is really consistent with our values to ensuring an environmentally just approach to climate change. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all 3 of you. Thanks a lot. So use the raise hand function. I have not moderated one of these before. Hopefully I will get it right, but we're using the raise hand function. I already see one, a familiar name, Richard Seckhauser. So Richard, over to you for a question. You're muted.
Looking at what's happened with regard to the Ukraine, where basically the world did nothing until the crisis was underway, I see little chance for the type of global conversation that we need before catastrophe is upon us. Indeed, if the worst outcome had happened with the Ukraine, which even the United States expected, namely a victory by Russia within a week, all of the efforts which eventually came together would not have happened. It wouldn't have stopped that disaster. I would also observe on the global cooperation, the prospects, at least for the near-term future, of effective cooperation with Russia and China seem slim. And even in dealing with the South, which is already dealing quite much more strongly than we are with adaptation measures, their demands are not going to be met by our willingness to pay. So I don't think that we're going to make much progress there. What I'm basically asking is, do you think we will be able to have this global conversation before we need it?
All right, over to panelists. Kelly first.
Well, a couple of things I'll say. Thank you for the question. In terms of the sort of underlying background of imperfect examples, but sometimes there's cooperation happening that's not at the level of a sort of a media and larger dialogue. And I think that builds in the case of Ukraine, where they were getting a lot of training, military assistance, and so on. Similar with the evolution of RNA vaccines. And so we weren't totally caught flat-footed, but we were in an imperfect spot. And I would say in this case, there's an opportunity to build scientific cooperation quickly. And in fact, there's a new program emerging in the World Climate Research Program, as well as I mentioned before, the Montreal Protocol. So there are things that we can do that may not be the biggest public dialogue, but that help lay foundations that actually help calm the waters maybe later. And in that context, with regard to the comment about China, interestingly, because we do have some interaction with the State Department, climate is actually one of the strongest areas of cooperation with China right now, even though it may not appear. And the progress that they made at the last COP was kind of an unexpected surprise. And there does appear an opportunity to, in scientific cooperation, to work with China here. So it may not be as dark as it seems.
Steve, I think I saw your hand, and I'm going to try and get other questions injected as well. So David Schwartz, or maybe it's Larry Bierbaum, it's not quite clear on the Q&A thing, has asked about any impacts on the non-use letter, which for those of you who don't know was both a research article and then a kind of activist statement effectively of banning research on solar geoengineering. So has it caused any discernible shifts in the climate community or in Congress? So first to Steve, but don't worry, you can get back on this, Kelly.
Yeah, so
First to Steve to answer
wanted,
Richard's question.
yeah, I just wanted to say that while one can, I'm not sure one ever has enough global consensus on action in the time you want, but it's important to have a growing body of involvement. And I think we are beginning to see that. So there is work in the global South, and there is a recognition that impacts will be more severe in the global South. And actually some very informal polling that was done at the last global meeting on these topics in Berlin, which is now, I've forgotten, 4 years ago, somebody can correct me. Actually, the representatives from the global South there were much more inclined to look at these topics seriously than those from the Europe and North America. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to go, but there is an engagement. And I think it is essential, because to get the kind of action we need, even in this domain, we need to get people more involved. We are seeing that there needs to be more commitment. There's a new NGO, Degrees, that's focused on that flowed out of SRMGI. I also, I guess, separate from this topic, I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are about the low-hanging fruit on action, working on methane and seeing how dramatically things have changed over the last decade in that context. I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. And I'm also seeing where the global projections on temperature increase are going down, not up, right? So that we're seeing that the actions are having some effect. Is it enough? No. Should we do more? Yes. And in terms of the use letter, I'm not going to comment on that. I haven't been enough involved. I'm not seeing an impact directly from where I sit, but I wouldn't comment on that as a universal.
Maybe I'll get a quick answer just on that one on the non-use letter from Kelly, because I think you'd be the best place to answer, and then maybe over to Joe.
We haven't seen an impact from that either. In policy spheres, it may have more of an impact internationally, but I think some of the responses to it were effective as well, and the scientific basis for some of the claims in it maybe were a bit counterproductive. So so far we haven't seen an impact from it.
Yeah. So Joe, do you want to come in, or should I go for the next question?
Yeah. So let me take two quick comments. One on the non-use letter. I think if we establish a standard that we have to have this like foolproof, perfect system of governance for solar geoengineering, it's a standard that is much too high and has not been met by our efforts on emission mitigation under the UNFCCC since 1992. That we're going to, it's just the nature of the international system and how we've designed it, that it's difficult to really have a strong system of multilateral governance. And so I think there's something that can be a sort of a thoughtful effort that falls short of what they call for, that we probably need if we're going to be serious about moving forward with this. I've not heard from anyone who I've been engaging with by phone or Zoom in DC who've really been thinking much about this issue, to get to Larry's question specifically. But I think it is important to recognize that we do have a number of voices, whether it's in the academic circle here, whether we see back from 2019, ICANN put out a statement quite critical of solar geoengineering. There's certainly a lot of these concerns that are aired out there. And I think as we get more serious in this debate and have a broader public debate, we need to be thoughtful in how we engage those who are quite concerned about this potential risk. The other comment I'll make real quick, David, with respect to developing countries that Richard raised, I think this is something where we need to make sure that there is the capacity in these countries for them to rely on experts in their governments or in their universities to be able to educate their leaders. Too often when I've participated in the UN climate negotiations, one often saw a number of the developing countries where they don't have the resources to staff all the different issues that they're engaged in. And so that's why I think it's important for us in the academic setting here to try to build research partnerships with those emerging scholars in those countries so that they can be contributing to the education of their leaders so that they can help participate in this international governance down the line.
Question to Kelly from Wake Smith. Kelly notes the focus of SilverLining is the next 30 to 40 years. Given how little we know about solar geoengineering or solar climate intervention, what relevance does Kelly imagine it will have during that time frame? That's Wake's question.
Well, so our approach is to propose that we drive toward an open ability to assess solar climate interventions in the context of near-term climate risk with an initial target of 5 years. And so the Earth system problem is a rapidly moving problem. And so we've got to start to map what we do to the time horizons that we're in. And so we're actually bringing forward the notion of trying to define a roadmap of the things that we need to put in place, research-wise, monitoring-wise, observations, modeling capabilities, so that we can look at these questions in the sort of relevant time horizon. And so that maybe within a decade, we might be able to look at, the possibility of having portfolio options in this category if they pass muster. And part of our thesis is that the US is uniquely positioned almost in the world in terms of its capabilities. There are parts of the world that have relevant capabilities, but it requires supercomputers, stratospheric research aircraft, and other types of assets that are hard to build out. And so for the United States in particular, to help drive the generation of information so that the rest of the world can look at that information, and to try to provide resources for people in the other parts of the world to help in that evaluation and assessment. That's sort of our theory of change here. But I think underlying Wade's question is probably the knowledge of how little we have. So the process underlying solar climate intervention is one of the biggest uncertainties in climate, and we've been underinvested and mostly flat invested in the problem of aerosol forcing on climate for quite a while. And at the same time, we don't have any technologies to actually study, to take things and generate this intentionally. So it's a tough problem that requires a pretty serious systematic amount of work. But we think the goal is to try to get that work done, share the information with the world in the hopes that we can make good decisions together.
If I could just jump in for one quick second there. I think it's really critical that it be co-creation. This can't be a US-driven set of actions. And what's interesting in the modeling that we did through SRMGI with the 9 different Global South countries and modeling groups, it clearly showed the capacity there was not. This was really, there was lots of synergy to be had in the modeling of looking at the impacts of solar geoengineering on the climate relative to the local climate implications of intervention or non-intervention. So I think we have to start from a different place and not make it US-centric. We have to do it collaboratively. It has to be across, or it will not be effective in reaching the global consensus we need to do these kind of interventions if we were to do them.
So Steve, I really agree. There's a really critical problem that many people lack awareness of, which is a real technology disparity to study the problems. So we've been working with Amazon on putting global climate models and data sets on the cloud, because right now there's a problem. We're big fans of the Global South Research Program that you're talking about, but even to study local impacts in their areas, these are petabyte data sets. They can't run the climate models at all because they require supercomputing. In many places, they have weak networks, intermittent power, and very little computing. So solving the technology disparity problem, there's a genuine problem that the resources required to do the global scale modeling, the big data sets, the machine learning, they aren't available in these parts of the world. And so trying to figure out how to partner and marry those capabilities and people so that they have access quickly is a really important part of the equation. Right now, even we're finding out that downscales of global climate models are not available for many of the vulnerable parts of the world. And so that sort of technology access, technology acceleration problem is a big part of the equation, because you don't get out from under needing these big tech resources to do this problem.
So I'm going to try and get to 2 more questions if I can. One is about the high elite level IPCC, and the second one about individual action. So from Jacob Lindis, there's a question about what does the IPCC do next on assessing these technologies? And specifically, is there talk about a special report? So I'm over to any of you. I think it's an interesting live topic. No? All right, I'll roll on to the next one if no one wants to jump onto that.
I can just say about the special report topic is that my understanding is there's a pretty hefty queue of special reports. And so it's pretty heavy lift to get in that queue.
That's right. Anything else anybody want to say? I'm trying to resist making any substantive comments myself. Does anybody else have, well, I think I'm not supposed to. Does anybody else have any comments on IPCC process in this?
Well, you're begging for it, David. So I will comply. I mean, just having participated, I have not most recently been involved with the IPCC. I'm not sure in this topic, this is necessarily the best next step. I think the National Academies and other places on a global basis, TWAS, is a more dynamic environment, and they have stepped up. And I think I think the key is it shouldn't just be the US or the Royal Society, which so far as I know, are the only ones who've written on the topic. It really needs to be a global collaboration of academies. And I know the academies interested in that, but I won't speak for them.
So then a question from the other side, Paige Brown asks, what can general citizens do to promote climate intervention policy agenda? So what can individual citizens do who want to see this agenda of whatever it is, research, understanding of these technologies, regulation of them move forward?
Well, I guess
I'm going to start calling on you because I think I'd like to hear from all of you on that, actually. Sorry, go ahead, Kelly, you're there.
Well, I was just jumping into the vacuum, but always you can call, you can contact your congressman and start to learn more, certainly on our website and on Harvard and others, to engage with the subject matter and start to learn more. And then, let policymakers, at least in the US, where there are pathways to supporting the research, you can actually, indicate your perception, and that's a pretty useful thing to do, especially now.
Steve or Joe want to comment on that? I think it's a fair question. I mean, to not give my answer, but I say I get lots of emails from individual citizens saying, what can I do? So I think it's reasonable to try and give some answer.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was just going to say, this is not my direct area, but I think it's important to send the message wherever you are in the world, is that we need to accelerate the rate at which we're understanding the climate, including this. So I think that's critical, is it's not because an exception to or distinct from, but rather, as we said in the Academy report, in 2015, right? The work that we need to look at climate interventions are just understanding the climate better. So let's go on with that. We need that to be able to mitigate. We need that to be able to adapt. So we need to get more focus on getting the necessary data so we can better, including, as Joe talked about, climate attribution, which is matured nicely in the last few years. So we need to get our representatives, our decision makers, our corporate decision makers to all lean in and say, we need better information. You need it if you're going to be a corporation so you can plan. You need it as an individual so you can get hand on to the next generations, a livable climate and a livable world, et cetera. But I think we should include this in, but not separate it out. It's just part of it. And give them okay, we're comfortable with a wide range of issues. They should all be worked on.
So to your question, David, I would say two things, and I recognize the risk of appearing biased when, as an academic, I say we need more research. But I think it builds on what we already heard. We do need more research. We do need to be better informed about, I think, both the natural science and the engineering of this as a strategy for managing climate change risk, but also understanding, I think, the social and behavioral issues associated with it as well, and think about how all that can inform our decision making. So part of it is, as a citizen who wants to be engaged in these debates, is to first try to get smarter by looking at these resources, but also thinking about how you can engage in the political process to try to promote this kind of learning. And I think related to that, the second point is to think creatively about how you engage the political process. There is you can write an email to your representative, to your senator. You can make a call, but you can also think about the fact that, as we have a debate on climate change policy, it engages those who represent us in Congress, those who work for our elected president, but it's engaging a lot of the key stakeholders. And so it's thinking through about how you engage, whether it's with national environmental groups like EDF, maybe a local environmental group, how you think about engaging with business leaders who want to get more and more serious about what is going to be the future of climate change policy, both because it has an implication for how they run and manage their business, but also they feel like more and more business leaders that they should have a say and a voice and can play an important constructive role in tackling climate change, even if it goes beyond the narrow objective of maximizing shareholder value. So I think there are a lot of different leaders and a lot of different aspects of our society who you can engage, and you try to get them to get smarter and learn about how then they're going to work on climate change. But some of it's not just how do we do solar geoengineering, but I think how do we be as creative and as ambitious as possible in exploiting all the different strategies we have for reducing climate change risk. And I think that kind of framework is one that is also going to be amenable to how we are going to have a broader public debate about what should be the role and can be the role of solar geoengineering as we do this research and we get smarter about it.
Thank you very much. So I think I'd like to just give over to Kelly and Steve for any final comments. I want to try and close us in a couple minutes, but comments on anything, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And I think I'd like to make my last comment referencing Joe's point about uncertainty. I think in the conversations that we've had with policymakers, with business people, and with people from all walks of life, the level of uncertainty that we have on these questions, what are our emissions doing as far as these cooling and warming forces? What would these interventions do? And where we're at in our knowledge base? We got really consistent agreement that the current level of uncertainty is not good, is not acceptable, and this is something we should invest against. So I think that there is a way we can talk about uncertainty, and that's a place that people can agree, whether they're coming at this from a sort of native, a favorable point of view or not. And that we really need to hone in on the fact that given the risk situation, that investing against this uncertainty is one of the highest return, most important investments we can make, especially for vulnerable people. So thanks for your comment, Joe, and thanks everyone.
Thanks very much. Steve?
Yeah, so I would concur with that, but I think we have to recognize our uncertainty and we try to reduce it, but without losing sight of the fact that we do have a lot we can do today, a tremendous amount to reduce the rate of warming and the total amount of warming, and a lot of it is not, it's well established. We know how to do it, and we need the will to do it. So I don't believe that the moral hazard is a serious concern in doing that, reducing those uncertainties, but we also need to make sure that our message is always dual. That let's use the levers that exist and push down hard at them, recognizing that there is uncertainty and we want to take out an equivalent of an insurance policy by reducing that uncertainty. And in so doing, then we can really address with the issue over the next 30 years. I am not believe that we should be thinking seriously about these interventions unless something catastrophic happens over the next 30 years, because we have so much we can do that will reduce the rate of warming. We need to do them. I don't know over the longer term. I think none of us do. Let's get the uncertainty reduced, and then we can deal with that when we need to.
Well, thank you both very much. Thanks to the audience for listening. Thanks for Joe Aldy for stepping up to be a commentator. Thanks to all the questioners. For more of the energy policy seminar series, stay tuned. For more information about the solar geoengineering policy seminars, go to geoengineering.harvard.environment.harvard.edu under events. And thank you very much all. Thank you all very much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.